So I was watching a first date unfold at a bistro the other night. When the check finally came, the guy didn't just pay it. He performed paying it.
Performed it.
Yeah. He made this grand, sweeping gesture to snatch the bill away from the woman, practically beaming with that old-school provider energy. You could see it in his face. He felt noble, powerful, completely in control.
Okay, I think I can picture this.
But the dynamic shifted the second they stepped onto the sidewalk. When the woman politely declined his offer to continue the night at his place, that benevolent protector mask just slipped.
Right.
Instantly. I overheard him venting on the phone a few minutes later, and the transformation was jarring. He was suddenly furious, ranting about how women have it so easy and live life on tutorial mode just because they get a free pasta dish on a Thursday.
Wow.
It was a fascinating, if, disturbing look at modern cognitive dissonance. To him, that $40 dinner was irrefutable proof of female privilege, a golden ticket that he felt should have purchased him something in return.
Right, the transaction.
Exactly. The fact that he genuinely equates the pressure to pay for a date with systemic power, while completely ignoring the transactional entitlement rotting underneath his chivalry, it really made me wonder, is this just a lack of perspective, or is there a genuine cognitive impairment at play here? That anecdote is, it's far more illuminating than just a simple bad date story. It's the perfect launch pad for this deep dive because it just crystallizes the core issue.
It really does.
So our mission today is to move past the surface level arguments, the free dinner fallacy, and explore the deep interconnected structures of systemic male privilege. We're going to dissect exactly how that transactional entitlement functions, what psychological costs it extracts from men like the one I saw, and crucially, how this entire system, which benefits men systemically, is nonetheless reinforced and, protected by our highest legal and economic structures.
And I think it's essential that we start by defining the framework here.
Okay.
We are analyzing systemic privilege, which is a construct that operates on these two dual and very damaging tracks.
Two tracks.
First, there are the profound, often catastrophic harms it creates for the primary victims of the system, who are, predominantly women and girls.
Right.
Second, and this is just as important for this conversation, are the rigid, damaging, and sometimes fatal constraints it imposes on the privileged group men.
So it's harming everyone, but in very different ways.
Precisely. And to truly grasp the scope of this issue, we have to connect the individual psychological detriments to the vast, impersonal mechanisms of judicial rulings, large-scale economic disparities, and the overwhelming mental health crisis that men are currently facing.
So that internal damage. That's our logical starting point for this exploration. Okay, so let's focus on the man in the bistro story again. His reaction was just pure incandescent fury when his expectation was denied.
Yeah.
That fury didn't just appear out of nowhere.
No, of course not.
It speaks to a deep psychological context that fundamentally conditions men to suppress their emotional range, vulnerability, sadness, or fear. They're interpreted by the system as weakness. Why is this performance of stoicism so central to male identity, and what is the trade-off they're making?
Well, the trade-off is social currents, sir. What's so fascinating here is how the patriarchy demands that emotional suppression because it is directly linked to granting high degrees of social status and power.
So you get power in exchange for bottling up your feelings.
In a way, yes. Masculinity, in this context, it's not a biological fact. It's a performance of rigid control. The ability to suppress emotion, to remain stoic and detached, serves as the gatekeeper to authority, credibility, and dominance in social and professional settings.
And that status is an incredibly valuable commodity.
It is. So even if a man intellectually understands that being emotionally closed off is harmful to his relationships or his personal well-being, the immediate social reward for maintaining that mask of stoicism is just too high to risk discarding it.
You risk losing your standing in the group.
Precisely. And that need for social currency can be magnified, particularly for men who might already face marginalization due to race or, economic standing. Being perceived as the masculine man, unemotional, decisive, physically dominant, it grants them a form of social currency they might otherwise be completely denied.
So it becomes a survival mechanism in a way.
It does. Because masculinity is so closely tied to status and power, it becomes profoundly difficult for men to challenge these norms. The minute they step outside the approved spectrum of male emotion, they risk being ridiculed, sidelined, or losing credibility.
Even if they know deep down it's not healthy.
Even if they intellectually grasp that this entire construct is fundamentally unhealthy or damaging, the social pressure is immense.
And what exactly does that approved emotional spectrum look like? I mean, it seems incredibly narrow.
It is extremely narrow. The approved emotions usually cluster around aggression, righteous anger, decisive confidence, or sometimes competitive joy.
The kind of emotions you'd see on a sports field or in a boardroom.
Exactly. Emotions like sadness, fear, grief, loneliness, or, and this is a crucial one, the need for sustained emotional support are heavily policed.
Policed by other men, by society.
By everyone, including themselves. So when men do experience distress, the socially acceptable way to manage it is often through outward destructive expressions like physical fighting or internal self-destructive coping mechanisms.
Right.
It's the ultimate self-policing mechanism that dictates how they're allowed to move through society.
And I mean, we don't have to guess at the consequences of this rigidity. We can see them clearly laid out in the statistics surrounding male mental health. The numbers are frankly devastating.
They are.
They show that while approximately 1 in 5 adults experience mental illness annually, the illness in men often goes completely untreated, unacknowledged, or misdiagnosed.
And that discrepancy in seeking help is just stark. It's a direct result of the societal constraints we're talking about. Men are far less likely to seek treatment than women, and when they do, they're often in a state of acute crisis.
They wait until it's an emergency.
Yes. The scale of the problem is huge. We're discussing an estimated 6 million men affected by depression every single year.
Every single year. And that's just the reported cases.
Exactly. But the most alarming statistic, the ultimate consequence of this enforced emotional isolation, is the suicide rate.
It's the highest signal of crisis you can have. Men die by suicide at a rate 4 times higher than women, accounting for a staggering 79% of all suicides recorded.
4 times higher. Let that sink in.
It means 4 out of every 5 families grieving a suicide are grieving a man who likely suffered in complete silence.
And we have to look beyond just depression to the coping behaviors that replace healthy emotional processing.
Like what?
Well, when men are not addressing their psychological distress directly, they turn to those immediately accessible, dangerous, and unhealthy coping mechanisms. We find that men are 2 to 3 times more likely to misuse drugs than women.
2 to 3 times.
Furthermore, they die due to alcohol-related causes at a significantly higher rate. We're talking approximately 62,000 deaths compared to 26,000 for women.
So this behavioral channeling, it reinforces the very idea the system demands. That facing a mental health challenge means resorting to self-medication or risky behavior or aggression.
Rather than seeking professional or interpersonal help. Yes.
And this whole cycle, it just leads to increased social isolation, which only exacerbates the issue.
It does.
I mean, men are often conditioned out of developing deep, non-romantic friendships that provide that kind of emotional ballast. So when a crisis hits, they just lack the necessary social safety nets that women often rely upon.
That lack of social support is absolutely critical. There are studies showing that social isolation is a significant predictor of mental health decline in older men, but the conditioning starts much, much earlier.
In boyhood.
Yes. They are taught to be independent providers, which means they are reluctant to admit dependency on others, even for something as basic as emotional support.
And for so many men, their identity is tied up in their job.
Completely. For many men, the workplace or their professional identity is their only recognized source of value. So if that career fails or if they face unemployment, the loss of identity and status can be catastrophic. It often leads directly to a crisis point.
So if the problem is so clearly prevalent and the consequences are so severe, the low treatment rate must be attributable to one major hurdle. And that hurdle is, well, it's almost certainly stigma.
Stigma is the wall. It's complex, and we can really define it in at least 4 layers, with each one reinforcing the others.
Okay, let's break that down.
First, you have social stigma, or public stigma. This is the widespread negative attitude rooted in the misperception that mental illness symptoms equate to having a weak character, or a lack of self-control, or poor moral fiber.
The pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality.
Exactly. And this belief system directly leads to discrimination, social avoidance, and professional rejection. So if a man seeks help, he is essentially confirming society's worst suspicion about him, that he's not tough enough.
Which leads directly to the next layer.
Which is self-stigma. This happens when the individual internalizes that social shame. They feel embarrassed, weak, and ashamed about their own symptoms or diagnosis.
So they hide it.
They actively hide or minimize their distress from everyone, including themselves. This is the voice in their head that tells them real men push through it.
But the system that's supposed to help can also perpetuate the problem, right?
Yes. There is also professional stigma. This is when health professionals themselves, doctors, nurses, even therapists, can inadvertently transfer and reinforce that stigmatization onto their clients.
How does that happen?
It could manifest as dismissive language, or minimizing the reported symptoms, or failing to recognize signs of depression in men who present with physical complaints, because men often somaticize their psychological distress.
Somaticize.
They experience it as physical pain, headaches, chronic back pain, stomach issues. It's their body expressing the distress their mind isn't allowed to.
I see. And finally, you have the broader cultural context, which can be the most insidious barrier depending on the community.
That is cultural stigma. It comprises the various ways specific cultures interpret and respond to mental illness, and it often deeply affects whether and what kind of help people seek. In many cultures, mental health is a taboo topic.
Can you give an example?
Well, for example, in the Black community, mental illness is often viewed as a sign of being fundamentally weak or broken. And this cultural reluctance is frequently rooted in historical trauma and deep, justifiable distrust of the healthcare system.
Can you elaborate on that distrust? What historical context drives that specific resistance to help seeking?
Well, the distrust is based on centuries of systemic mistreatment. You have horrific ethics failures like the infamous Tuskegee experiment, where Black men were intentionally left untreated for syphilis for decades under the guise of observation.
So, observed, yes.
And this history fosters a deep intergenerational belief that the healthcare system is not only unreliable, but actively dangerous.
So seeking treatment for an invisible illness like depression isn't just seen as a sign of weakness.
It's seen as an act of vulnerability to a system that has historically caused severe harm. And that profound reluctance dramatically impacts treatment rates.
So the overall outcome of this layered stigma, social, self-professional, and cultural, is this powerful force that actively discourages help seeking among men.
Yes. They're trapped by the very norms designed to confer status, leading directly to the worsening of psychological distress, increased substance abuse, and sadly, higher rates of mortality. They are bearing a catastrophic psychological cost for the system that simultaneously grants them systemic power.
And this psychological rigidity, this need for control, it brings us back neatly to the man in the bistro and his complaint, the free pasta dish argument.
Right.
This is the most common, superficial misconception used to dismiss discussions of systemic male privilege. It positions women as the beneficiaries of a supposed female privilege based on chivalry. It's the ultimate distraction.
It is a distraction because it's a complete false equivalency. The idea that women benefit from chivalry entirely fails to address the systemic nature of male privilege, which operates across every single economic and legal institution.
It's comparing an apple to an orchard.
Exactly. In fact, chivalry often does the opposite of empowering women. It functions as a performance designed to reinforce the patriarchal idea that women are inherently weak, submissive, and require constant financial and physical protection from men.
It treats them as delicate dependents, not as equals.
Precisely. And the moment the man in the story was denied his expected return sexual interest, the protector facade dropped and the entitlement was exposed.
It wasn't about being a nice person, it was transactional control.
That transactional nature is critical to understand. When men perform the nice guy routine or engage in acts of chivalry, paying for dinner, opening doors, offering favors, it is often done with an explicit or, more commonly, an implicit expectation of receiving something in return.
And that something is usually...
Okay. It's almost always affirmation, control, or sexual access. The performance of benevolence is simply the cost of doing business. It's an investment.
And when that perceived return on investment is denied, when the woman asserts her autonomy, as the woman in the bistro did by declining his invitation, that investment is viewed as a loss. And that can trigger dire consequences.
Absolutely. The rage and fury stem from the man feeling entitled to her body or her attention as compensation for his performance of chivalry or being the provider. The psychological damage we just talked about, the inability to handle emotional rejection or loss of control, it manifests here as externalized rage and, in extreme cases, violence.
So the entitlement isn't just some isolated emotional outburst.
No, it's deeply rooted in the system that tells him his status is tied to control over women and resources.
Okay, so if the chivalry myth is just a distraction, what is the actual structural economic reality that women face? We need to look at how systemic male privilege is financially codified, often veiled by this supposedly gender-neutral language of the market.
The Economic consequences are vast and enduring. They create a foundational subordination that a free dinner cannot possibly offset. We have to start with the most obvious metric, the wage gap.
Right.
And although there has been some reduction in the gap over time, the rate of closure has slowed drastically in recent decades. The projection is, well, it's chilling. At the current rate of decline, the wage gap will not close for another 700 years.
700 years. That means 7 centuries of women systematically accumulating less wealth, less capacity for investment, and less financial independence, simply based on their gender.
And we need to look at the mechanics of why the gap persists. It's not just about raw salary comparisons. A major factor is occupational segregation.
Meaning women are clustered in certain types of jobs.
Yes. Women remain highly concentrated in lower-paying, often care-oriented fields like education and healthcare. Another huge factor is the motherhood penalty.
Motherhood penalty.
Women's wages immediately drop upon having children, while men's wages often stabilize or even increase. That's the fatherhood premium, because they are perceived as more stable and committed providers.
Why?
And in our society, money is the widest and most objective yardstick of success and competence. So less money means less perceived competence, less power, and less ability to exert influence.
The devaluation isn't just restricted to raw wages either. It's enshrined in how the system values women's work, and even how it compensates for their suffering.
That's the deeper issue. The legal and judicial systems have a history of systematically undervaluing women's harms and their economic contributions. For instance, when women are plaintiffs in tort cases involving injury or wrongdoing, they often receive less compensation in the aggregate compared to men.
Why is that?
It happens because injuries sustained by women are frequently classified as lower-ranked harm or non-economic loss, things like pain and suffering or emotional distress. Meanwhile, pecuniary or economic losses, like lost future wages or property damage, are privileged in recovery.
So why is the legal system predisposed to classify women's harm as non-economic? Does this track back to ancient legal notions of property?
It absolutely does, and it's crucial context. It stems directly from the ancient concept of women as property, specifically the concept known as loss of consortium.
Loss of consortium.
Historically, if a man was injured and couldn't work, his wife had a claim for loss of support. But if a wife was injured, the husband could sue for loss of consortium, meaning the loss of her services, domestic labor, child rearing, and, most explicitly, sexual availability. She was an economic asset.
So the compensation wasn't for her suffering.
It was for the husband's loss of an asset, precisely. For example, historically, adultery involving an unfaithful wife was treated as a property-like loss for the husband. He lost control over his asset. But if the husband was unfaithful, the wife's only recourse was classified as emotional or non-economic loss.
And that historical bias still influences modern law.
It does. Judges sometimes struggle to grant full monetary damages to female plaintiffs, which reinforces the idea that their economic value is secondary or purely service-oriented.
And then we come to the greatest economic omission of all. The massive amount of unpaid domestic labor, performed almost exclusively by women.
This is perhaps the biggest hidden economic scandal. Women's work in the home, the immense amount of unpaid caregiving, cleaning, and emotional labor receives no economic value whatsoever from the state or the market.
None.
Zero. Estimates suggest that if this unpaid labor were monetized, it would represent a massive percentage of the global GDP. This systemic omission fundamentally keeps women out of the official, recognized economic sphere.
And if the work isn't valued, it can't contribute to long-term financial stability.
Exactly. When you aggregate all these factors, less compensation in tort, lower market wages, and zero recognized value for domestic labor, the economic disparity leads to lower savings, lower pension contributions, and subsequently, lower Social Security benefits over a lifetime.
It's a cycle.
It solidifies the cycle of economic subordination under the guise of gender-neutral market forces. Even neutral-sounding tax rules, which were often developed when the male breadwinner model was dominant, frequently disadvantage secondary wage earners, who are predominantly women, by imposing higher effective marginal tax rates on their income.
So the systemic economic discrimination remains entirely veiled within supposedly neutral legal and financial language.
That's it, exactly.
Okay, we've established that systemic privilege imposes severe psychological costs on men and profound economic costs on women. Now we have to look at how this privilege is not just reflected, but actively codified and protected in the judicial system. Let's focus on gender-based violence against women and girls, or GBVAWG, as a critical arena where this systemic bias is exposed and perpetuated.
GBV-AWG is defined as violence directed towards women specifically because of their gender or sex, and it is intrinsically rooted in a social context of gendered hierarchy.
It's about power.
The violence is ultimately aimed at exerting power and maintaining control. It takes multiple forms: physical, sexual, psychological, and economic harm. And while it can occur in public, intimate partner and family-related homicides are the most visible and tragic forms.
The global data on this is, well, it's horrifying.
It is. It confirms the relentless scale of this issue. 137 women across the world are intentionally killed by a current or former intimate partner or family member every single day.
Every single day. And despite this clear prevalence, despite increased public awareness, and despite extensive legislative reform in many countries, changing criminal laws, creating institutional policies, we haven't seen a dramatic reduction in GBV-AWG. Why do these reforms keep failing to meet their goals?
The problem is not just the written law, it's how the law is interpreted and applied by human beings. This violence remains highly prevalent, socially tolerated, and largely unpunished because the judiciary, the body meant to ensure accountability, is itself subject to deeply ingrained societal biases.
So judges bring their own biases to the bench.
Judges are uniquely positioned to interpret laws through the lens of substantive equality and international human rights standards. However, judges are people who come to the bench with their own, often strongly held unconscious values, which can lead directly to something called judicial stereotyping.
Okay, so this is where harmful gender bias explicitly and materially enters the courtroom, and it often acts as a shield for the accused. How do we precisely define judicial stereotyping in a way that captures its destructive legal function?
Judicial stereotyping is the practice of judges ascribing specific attributes, characteristics, or roles to an individual solely based on their membership in a particular social group, in this case, gender.
So they're judging the person, not the facts.
Yeah, essentially, yes. By failing to actively challenge and dismantle harmful gender stereotypes, judges inadvertently perpetuate the very myths about GBV-AWG that trivialize the violence, shift blame, and deny justice. The effect is that the victim's claim is judged based on who she is perceived to be, rather than the facts of what happened.
Let's break down the specific pervasive myths that judges often rely on, whether consciously or unconsciously, to undermine a victim's testimony. The first and most pervasive has to be the standard of the ideal victim.
The ideal victim myth. It assumes that a real victim would behave in a very specific, narrow, and often counterintuitive way.
What does that look like?
The myth demands that she would fight back aggressively, that she would immediately report the violence, and that she would present with visible physical injuries.
But that's not how trauma works.
Not at all. A judge operating under this myth might look at a delayed disclosure, say a woman reporting sexual assault weeks later, and wrongly deem it suspicious or irrelevant, believing that a truthful victim would have rushed straight to the police.
Which completely trivializes cases where the victim suffers internal psychological trauma, or when sexual violence leaves no physical trace.
Which research confirms is often the case.
And this often pairs with attacks on the victim's character or past behavior, regardless of how relevant it is.
These are the sexual history chastity myths. They demand that a woman's testimony is only trustworthy if she conforms to the standard of the good woman or is perceived as sexually chaste or passive.
So if a judge finds out the victim had consumed alcohol, was flirting, or had a complex sexual history,
that judge might improperly use that information to prove consent, or at least to discredit her testimony. Evidence of a lack of physical resistance, perhaps the woman froze in terror, is mistakenly used to establish consent rather than recognizing it as a trauma response.
And this feeds directly into the belief that victims are inherently prone to exaggeration or lying.
That's the third myth, the motives to lie myth. Judges frequently assume women fabricate claims for ulterior motives, maybe seeking revenge or extorting money, or most frequently gaining an advantage in custody battles or family law proceedings.
So they look for any other reason besides the actual violence.
Yes. For instance, you see cases where judges spend more time obsessing over a victim's potential financial gain from a divorce settlement or custody leverage than they do assessing the credibility of the violence allegations themselves. They focus on irrelevant issues, like the victim's finances or relationship status, and that distracts from the defendant's actions.
And finally, there's the tendency to minimize any abuse that isn't overtly violent or life-threatening.
The myth of minimizing violence. This assumes that real domestic violence requires catastrophic physical injury or even death.
So psychological abuse doesn't count.
It causes judges to adopt a very narrow definition of offenses and ignore or dismiss evidence of psychological violence, coercive control, or economic abuse as not constituting real intimate partner violence. Psychological abuse can be just as devastating as physical abuse, yet judges operating on this myth may dismiss it as mere relational conflict rather than a form of sustained power and control.
And compounding all of these judicial biases is the fundamental misunderstanding many legal professionals have regarding the neurobiological impact of trauma on memory. Victims on the stand often present as incoherent or illogical, which judges then interpret as deceit.
But that perceived illogical behavior is a biologically reflexive survival mechanism, not a sign of dishonesty. Traumatic events cause immense emotional shock that fundamentally modifies the brain.
How so?
The brain's priority during an attack is survival, and that actively suppresses the higher cognitive functions responsible for linear, logical sequencing and detailed recall.
So when a victim testifies, their memory isn't like a film they can rewind.
Not at all. They might recall scattered, disparate sensory details, the smell of the perpetrator's jacket, the sound of a clock ticking, or the color of the carpet, but be completely unable to reconstruct the timeline or the order of events.
I've heard it described.
Researchers describe it as memory being like hundreds of tiny notes that are scattered across the desk. The bits of information may be accurate, but disordered and incomplete.
And the victim's physical or emotional response in the moment of violence is also frequently misinterpreted as rational consent.
Yes. Victims respond instinctively with what are often called the 5 Fs: fight, flight, freeze, flop, or befriend. If a victim assesses they are overpowered or unable to escape, they may submit or dissociate, that's freeze or flop, as a desperate attempt to prevent unnecessary escalation or to physically survive the event.
And a judge might see that as compliance.
Crucially, a judge operating on a linear model of rational behavior may misinterpret the submission or lack of active resistance as consent.
The befriend response seems particularly difficult for a judge to reconcile with the traditional definition of resistance. Can you provide more detail on how that functions as a survival tactic?
The befriend response is a survival mechanism where the victim attempts to appease the attacker or establish a human connection or minimize the violence by complying with small requests.
Can you give me an example of that?
For instance, asking a rapist to wear a condom is a horrifying but biologically reflexive act of befriend. It is done by the victim to survive and avoid the transmission of disease or pregnancy, not as an act of sexual consent.
But in the courtroom?
In the courtroom, defense tactics may highlight this compliance to suggest the victim was participating, thereby weaponizing a desperate survival instinct against her credibility.
And we see this legal reinforcement of bias not just in how judges assess evidence, but in how it shapes the very foundation of constitutional law and civil rights. The landmark case of U.S. v. Morrison concerning the Violence Against Women Act, specifically Title III, which created a civil remedy for gender-based violence, is a crucial illustration of systemic privilege at work.
Morrison is profoundly important because it reveals the Supreme Court's willingness to draw a line in the sand specifically against remedies for gender-based violence.
What did they do?
The court struck down VAWA Title III, relying on a deeply narrow interpretation of the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. The majority ruled that Congress could only regulate activity that was economic in nature, thereby imposing a restrictive substantial effects test only when the activity itself was commercial.
But Congress had compiled mountains of evidence showing that violence against women was an economic issue, right? They provided specific, large-scale financial findings.
They provided voluminous legislative findings. They detailed the massive, demonstrable economic impact of violence against women on the national economy.
And what did that impact include?
It included reducing victims' mobility across state lines, lowering workforce productivity due to time off for injury or trauma, and decreasing consumption in interstate commerce. The figures were concrete. Congress cited the annual cost of domestic violence alone as $3 billion in 1990, rapidly escalating to between $5 and $10 billion by 1993.
So the economic argument was undeniable.
It was, yet the court disregarded it entirely.
How can the court uphold economic arguments in other contexts, but dismiss them when they concern gender-based violence?
This is where the discriminatory application becomes clear and the hypocrisy is stark. The court had a long history of upholding federal regulation of activities that were arguably far less economic in nature.
Like what?
Consider the precedent of Wickard v. Filburn. In that case, the court upheld the federal regulation of a farmer who was growing wheat for personal consumption on his own land.
For his own family to eat.
Yes. They argued that even though the activity was private and non-commercial, its cumulative effect on the national wheat market was substantial enough to warrant federal intervention under the Commerce Clause.
So private violence against women costing billions and impacting the national workforce is ruled non-economic, but growing a bushel of wheat for your family is deemed sufficiently economic for federal oversight. That's a massive contradiction.
It is more than a contradiction, it's a reflection of bias. The court had also upheld landmark civil rights cases, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964, concerning racial discrimination in public accommodations, based on the aggregate economic effects, even though racial discrimination is non-economic in the traditional sense.
So they've done it before.
By choosing to stop the flood of federalization, specifically at gender-based violence, the court signaled that these issues were somehow less worthy of federal remedy than private wheat consumption or racial discrimination.
And by striking down Vewey Title III, the court essentially reinforced the idea that violence against women belongs to the private sphere, or family law.
Exactly. The decision not only failed to correct for the traditional undervaluation of women's work and harms, but actively reinforced subordination by adding this further discriminatory factor to its analysis. The ruling reaffirmed the insidious private-public dichotomy, treating violence against women, even in a high-profile case involving a gang rape by strangers at a public university, as a localized private issue rather than a national economic or civil rights failure.
And the effect was to convey the inaccurate impression that such crimes are rare and deviant,
when the data shows they are systemic and costly.
So if the law itself is biased, the adversarial court system often delivers the final, cruel blow. For victims, the courtroom often feels as traumatic as the original violence itself, leading to what is called secondary victimization.
Absolutely.
It demands that victims publicly relive and repeatedly recount the most intimate and violating traumas in a sterile, judgmental environment.
And the adversarial system is fundamentally structured to produce this secondary victimization, largely driven by defense tactics. Defense lawyers are sometimes openly trained, often in seminars, to employ a tactic often colloquially referred to as whacking the complainant hard during the preliminary inquiry.
Whacking the complainant? That sounds brutal.
The goal is cynical: to destroy the head of the Crown's case, and perhaps more effectively, encourage the victim not to return for trial, which conveniently makes the case disappear.
And what specific tools are used in this strategy of whacking?
This tactic relies heavily on using cross-examination questions, grounded in those harmful gender myths we just discussed. The defense introduces irrelevant evidence to destroy the victim's character, thereby rendering them not credible.
What kind of irrelevant evidence?
A prime example involves detailed, humiliating cross-examination about the victim's clothing or personal choices leading up to the assault. For instance, asking about the type or color of underwear she wore, whether she was drinking alcohol or if she was wearing a bra.
But the facts about her underwear have zero legal relevance to consent. What is the implied message the defense is trying to send to the jury or the judge?
The inference is that the kind of woman who engages in these behaviors or dresses a certain way is not a credible witness who deserves legal protection, or worse, was asking for it. This shifts the focus entirely from the defendant's actions and intent to the victim's perceived moral failure.
And the judge is supposed to stop that.
The judiciary has a duty to exclude irrelevant, highly prejudicial evidence, but too often, judges allow this line of questioning. In doing so, they fail in their duty to balance the defendant's right to a robust defense with the victor's right to dignity and protection from secondary victimization.
The power imbalance in the courtroom structure must just exacerbate this procedural harm.
It absolutely does. Defense counsel often dominates the linguistic space. They use highly controlled, closed, and leading questions to rigidly control the narrative, forcing the victim into yes or no answers.
Which constantly interrupts the victim's ability to tell her story coherently.
Especially when the memory of trauma is naturally fragmented. The court process itself thus becomes traumatic, effectively reifying the power dynamics of the original violence, where the victim's voice and autonomy were suppressed.
We also see the system often failing to recognize the unique dynamics of intimate partner violence, or IPV, particularly regarding risk and non-reporting.
Yes. IPV follows a well-documented cycle: tension building, violence, and the honeymoon phase. Victims often recognize the tension-building phase and, in a survival attempt, try to keep the peace by minimizing or failing to report incidents,
which courts then misinterpret.
This attempt at survival is frequently misinterpreted by courts as a lack of seriousness or truthfulness. And crucially, judges must be aware that the most dangerous time for a victim is often after separation.
Separation is counterintuitively not a protective measure.
It is often the opposite. Separation triggers a perpetrator's ultimate loss of control, and their response can be lethal. One comprehensive study found that a harrowing 76% of women killed by ex-partners or ex-spouses happened within the first year following separation.
So judges must look beyond the immediate incident to assess the cumulative risk factors that signal extreme danger.
They have to.
What are the specific, crucial risk factors judges should be explicitly trained to look for during proceedings involving IPV?
Well, the number one major, often overlooked risk factor for homicide is non-fatal strangulation. Yes. Strangulation, even when not immediately fatal, can cause severe, permanent neurological damage or lead to death days later. And alarmingly, only about half of victims have visible external injuries.
So you can't just look for bruises on the neck.
Exactly. Non-fatal strangulation has been associated with more than a 6-fold increase in the odds of becoming an attempted homicide and a 7-fold increase in the odds of becoming a completed homicide. Judges need to understand that defendants charged with seemingly minor offenses can be just as dangerous as those charged with more serious offenses, especially when this high risk factor is present.
Finally, we have to address the complex scenario where the victim of repeated violence becomes the defendant. We see women who have been targeted repeatedly sometimes use violence in self-defense, a phenomenon known as victim resistance violence.
And international human rights standards strongly urge courts to consider these self-defense claims with specialized knowledge. This is where expert evidence on domestic violence, we avoid the dated and pathologizing term battered woman syndrome, is crucial.
And this evidence covers what, exactly?
It covers the complex psychological, social, and economic aspects of long-term violence and control.
How does this specialized evidence practically inform a judicial decision?
Judges can use this expert evidence in two main ways. First, to assess the defendant's state of mind in a self-defense claim, determining if, given the context of years of abuse, she had a reasonable fear of imminent danger, even if the immediate threat wasn't visible to an external observer.
In the second way.
Second, it can be used as a mitigating circumstance during sentencing. The evidence helps explain why a woman might remain in an abusive relationship, why her actions might appear disproportionate in isolation, but are actually a psychological response to the growing tension and cumulative harm caused by the cycle of violence.
So it acknowledges that they are acting as a result of the systematic violence inflicted upon them, rather than simply as the primary aggressor in a mutual dispute.
Exactly. The system must consider the entire pattern and the cumulative effects over time, rather than focusing exclusively on the final fatal incident, which is the easiest way to draw an erroneous conclusion about responsibility.
Are there examples of this working?
We have seen progressive judicial practices globally, such as in Uganda, where judges have sentenced women charged with murder who killed their abusive husbands to non-custodial sentences, recognizing that the woman was primarily a victim who needed rehabilitation and societal protection rather than incarceration.
So this holistic view means courts most reject the notion that a victim using violence means she is necessarily the primary aggressor.
Yes, especially since many perpetrators are highly manipulative and learn how to provoke or set up their partners to engage in violent actions they can then use against them in court.
Right.
The Canadian Supreme Court recognized this need for a holistic view by identifying the central elements of domestic violence in a criminal context that judges must factor in. The imbalance of power, the dependency and lowered self-esteem of the less powerful person, and the periodic nature of the abuse that produces profound and cumulative psychological consequences.
That's the difference between simply applying the law and achieving substantive justice. We've traced a continuous thread today, moving from a single entitled outburst over a $40 dinner at a bistro, all the way to the bedrock of constitutional interpretation in criminal justice. The core finding is, I think, irrefutable. The issue is not some trivial female privilege for getting a meal paid for, but rather systemic male privilege that is deeply rooted in cultural norms, protected by rigid economic structures, and continually reinforced by judicial tradition.
And the man in the bistro was, in his fury, demonstrating the severe psychological cost extracted by the patriarchy, the emotional illiteracy, the rigidity, and the shame of perceived loss of control. But his reaction was a performance of the transactional entitlement that systemically damages women, both economically, through the generational undervaluation of their work and harm, and through the profound denial of justice in the courtroom. By upholding legal standards that essentially disqualify claims of gender-based violence from federal intervention, the system continues to treat violence against women differently, upholding that insidious and dangerous private-public dichotomy.
So ultimately, the persistence of these myths and judicial biases, from the ideal victim expectation to the narrow legal application of economic harm in cases like Morrison, means that the legal system consistently fails to grant women equal protection of the law. Instead of substantive equality, the system prioritizes and protects traditional, often archaic assumptions about gender roles, their emotional capacity, and the nature of harm. The system, in effect, maintains the privilege of some at the expense of justice for all.